Welcome to the English Bookcast.
Hello there.
Today we're embarking on a really fascinating deep dive into the book Early Man in South America, Hrdlicka's Investigations. It's by the renowned anthropologist Ales Hrdlickas.
Yes, and before we jump in, we'd really like to invite you, our listener, to become part of the English Bookcast community.
That's right.
Please think about joining our channel, maybe sharing this exploration with anyone you think might find it as interesting as we do. Your support honestly helps us grow and bring more deep dives like this one to you.
It really does. You know, the question of when humans first actually set foot in South America, it's one that's captivated researchers for, well, centuries.
Absolutely.
And in this deep dive, we're going to immerse ourselves in Hrdlicka's critical look at the evidence that was being put forward in his time, to answer that exact question. Our primary sources, like we said, are Hrdlicka's own meticulous accounts of his investigations and his really detailed analyses of what others had reported.
So we're going straight to the source, essentially.
Exactly. We want to give you a clear understanding of the complexities, even some of the controversies surrounding this topic, but without, getting bogged down in just overwhelming detail.
All right, we're looking for the surprising nuggets, the bigger picture of what Hrdlicka's work actually reveals.
Precisely.
Okay, so to kick things off then, let's maybe look at Hrdlicka's initial foray into this field. His expedition to Argentina with a Mr. Willis, it sounds like quite an undertaking.
It really does.
They specifically targeted locations like Rio Negro, Arroyo Siasco, Alver, and Ovejero. And they did this because these were places where fossil human bones and, well, other signs of great antiquity had been reported.
Right. So it wasn't just a casual look around, was it? They were going to specific sites where claims had already been made.
Yeah, targeted investigation.
For instance, Alver, you mentioned Alver, that had already got some attention because it yielded what was described as baked earth. Now, some people took this as evidence of ancient human fires, didn't they?
They did, exactly. And what's really crucial to understand here, you see, is that Hrdlicka and Willis went to these very spots to do their own firsthand examinations.
Right. Not just reading reports.
No, they weren't just relying on secondhand accounts. So in the case of Alver, by looking at the geological context and the nature of this baked earth, they could try to figure out if it truly pointed to ancient human activity or if maybe there could be a natural explanation for how it formed.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. It's about that direct observation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And trying to rule out other non-human causes. And their travels didn't actually stop there, did they? The expedition expanded. Tucumán, San Juan, Mendoza. It's interesting that this extension had both geological and anthropological aims.
Yes, that's a key point. Hrdlicka was clearly thinking broadly, about the environment these potential early humans might have lived in.
Right, the whole picture.
Exactly. By studying the geology of these regions, he could get a better handle on the age of the deposits where human remains or artifacts were supposedly found. This sort of interdisciplinary approach, combining geological and anthropological views, was actually quite significant for the time. And of course, his investigations then went on into Peru as well, further broadening his scope across South America.
Okay, so after all this pretty extensive travel and firsthand investigation across these different sites in Argentina and Peru, Hrdlicka eventually arrived at a very firm central argument, didn't he?
He did, yes. After meticulously looking at the evidence he found and, reviewing the reports of others, Hrdlicka basically concluded that the data available at that time did not convincingly support the hypothesis of a great human antiquity in South America. And furthermore, he found no compelling evidence for the existence of human evolutionary predecessors on the continent.
Wow. That's a rather decisive statement, isn't it? So if he's rejecting the idea of great antiquity and, local human ancestors, what did he think the evidence did point to?
Well, his primary conclusion was that the findings predominantly attested to the presence of what he considered the already differentiated and, relatively modern American Indian.
Okay.
So, in essence, he argued that the human presence in South America, as shown by the finds he studied, wasn't indicative of extremely ancient origins or some separate evolutionary path. It just represented the arrival and diversification of populations related to those we know as Native American.
Right. So he's not saying humans never got to South America. He's challenging the when and the how of that arrival. He's pushing back against theories that suggested either a much, much earlier time or an independent evolutionary line right there on the continent.
Precisely.
This is where that petrographic analysis comes in then. Fred Eugene Wright and Clarence N. Fenner, they did a study on specimens collected during the Hrdlicka-Willis expedition. Now, for someone maybe not familiar, What exactly is petrographic analysis?
Okay, think of it like using really powerful microscopes to examine the composition and structure of rocks and sediments.
Okay.
It's sort of like being a microscopic detective for geological materials. By analyzing thin slices of these materials, scientists can identify the minerals they contain, how they're arranged, and essentially unravel their history, how they formed and what processes they've undergone.
That's a great way to put it, microscopic detective work for rocks.
hmm
So what kind of specimens were Wright and Fenner looking at, and where did these samples come from?
They analyzed three main types. Loess, which is a very fine wind-blown dust or silt that can build up in thick deposits. Tierra cocida, which literally means cooked earth, and was often interpreted as evidence of ancient fires or maybe even human-made kilns.
Right.
And scoria, which is a porous volcanic rock. The samples themselves were collected from various locations across Argentina that were pretty significant in this whole debate about early man. Places like Buenos Aires, Alvear near Mar del Plata and Miramar, Necochea, Monte Hermoso, Rio Colorado, and San Bias.
Okay, a wide range of sites. And what was the goal of this petrographic analysis in the context of Hrdlička's work? What were they hoping to learn about early humans?
Well, the primary goal wasn't necessarily to directly spot human artifacts under the microscope. It was more about understanding the nature and origin of the materials themselves.
Oh, okay.
So, for example, by analyzing Tierra cocida, they could try to determine if its characteristics were consistent with being formed by ancient human fires, or if it could have resulted from natural processes like, say, vegetation burning, or even geological events.
Right.
Similarly, understanding the origin and age of the lowest deposits was crucial for dating any artifacts found within them. If a layer thought to hold ancient tools was actually a relatively recent geological formation, well, that would undermine the claims of great antiquity, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. It's all about getting that reliable geological and environmental context sorted out first. You need to be sure that what you think is an ancient human artifact isn't just a naturally formed rock, or that the layer it was found in is actually as old as people claim.
Exactly. Context is everything.
Now, the outline also mentions these peculiar stone industries of the Argentine coast and the work of W.H. Holmes. This sounds like a different line of investigation into early human activity.
It is, yeah. While the petrographic analysis focused on the geology, the study of stone tools directly examines potential evidence of early human technology. W.H. Holmes, who was a prominent archaeologist, identified two distinct groups of stone tool industries along that Argentine coast.
Okay, and what were the key differences between these northern and southern groups that Holmes saw?
Well, the northern group, found along the coast, seemed to mostly use readily available beach pebbles.
Makes sense.
The tools were often made from chipped white quartzites and appeared, well, relatively simple, mostly resembling domestic utensils, things you might use for everyday tasks.
So fairly basic technology, maybe suggesting a less sophisticated or perhaps older culture, or maybe not.
Not necessarily older in terms of vast geological time, perhaps, but maybe representing different cultural adaptations or needs. Holmes contrasted this with the southern group, which he primarily located down in the Rio Negro district. Those tools seem to have different characteristics, both in the materials used and the techniques employed to make them.
And did these differences in stone tool tech shed any light on, say, the ethnicity or the age of the people who made them?
Well, that's precisely what Holmes and consequently Hrdlička were trying to figure out. The variations in tool types and manufacturing techniques could potentially indicate different groups of people with distinct cultural traditions. Furthermore, the discussion around these stone industries also noted the occasional presence of earthenware, pottery at some of these sites.
And pottery is generally seen as a marker of a more recent period in human tech development, right?
Exactly. Pottery typically shows up later in the archaeological record than simple chipped stone tools. So the association of earthenware with some of these stone industries suggested that at least some of these coastal sites were likely occupied by relatively recent indigenous populations, rather than extremely ancient early man.
Okay.
Hrdlička, drawing on Holmes's detailed work, tended to align these stone tool traditions with the known cultural practices of various American Indian tribes, rather than seeing them as evidence of vastly earlier distinct populations.
So across different lines of evidence, the geological analysis of sediments, the study of stone tools, we're seeing this consistent tendency in Hrdlička's work to find explanations pointing towards more recent known indigenous groups rather than backing up claims of very ancient human presence or distinct early human ancestors in South America.
That seems to be the trend, yes.
Right. Now let's shift focus a bit to another crucial area, skeletal remains, and this idea of the quaternary man. The outline mentions the really significant Lagoa Santa discoveries in Brazil. Can you tell us about those?
Ah, yes. The discoveries made by Peter Wilhelm Lund in the Lagoa Santa region of Brazil were, well, they were hugely significant. They played a major role in the early debates about human antiquity in South America.
Yeah.
Lund explored numerous caves in this area, and he unearthed a substantial number of human skeletal remains. What made these finds particularly intriguing was that they were sometimes found in the same geological layers as the bones of extinct animal species, the megafauna that roamed South America during the Quaternary period, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats.
Wow. And the fact that human bones were found right alongside the remains of these extinct animals, that was taken as pretty strong evidence that humans and these megafauna were contemporaries, living at the same time, which would imply a considerable antiquity for the human remains, wouldn't it?
That was definitely the prevailing interpretation for many. The association seemed to suggest humans had been in South America for a very, very long time, potentially dating back to the late Pleistocene epoch.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, as the outline points out, Lund himself was actually quite cautious in drawing definitive conclusions about this contemporaneity.
Oh, what were the reasons for his hesitation? Why wasn't he completely sold on the idea that the human bones and the extinct animal bones were deposited at the exact same time?
Lund's caution really stemmed from the often disturbed context in which the remains were found within the caves.
Oh,
The
okay.
human bones weren't always in a clear primary archaeological layer directly mixed in with the animal bones. There was always the possibility of later burials or natural disturbances that could have mixed remains from different time periods.
Right, like a later burial digging down into an older layer.
Exactly. A human burial could easily have been placed in a cave that already contained older animal fossils. Plus, the condition of the human bones themselves sometimes suggested a more recent origin than the often heavily fossilized animal remains. Lund also observed two distinct types of skulls among the Lagoa Santa, finds one sort of longer and narrower, the other shorter and broader, which just added another layer of complexity to understanding the population and its potential age. So, while the association was suggestive, the lack of really definitive stratigraphic evidence made Lund hesitant to just proclaim them as unequivocally contemporaneous.
That really highlights the importance of context in archaeology and paleontology, doesn't it? Just finding things nearby isn't enough. You need that solid, undisturbed layer to confidently say they belong to the same time.
Absolutely critical.
Now, this brings us to a major point of contention for Hrdlicka, his critique of Florentino Ameghino's scheme of human evolution in South America. This sounds like a really central disagreement.
Oh, it was. It was a very significant point of disagreement and actually one of the main focuses of Hrdlicka's investigations. Florentino Ameghino, an Argentinian paleontologist and anthropologist, had proposed this very detailed and, well, at the time, quite radical scheme of human evolution that he believed had taken place primarily in South America.
Yeah.
He went so far as to propose several new genera of hominins with names like Diprothomo, Tetraprothomo, and Tetraprothomo, which he saw as direct ancestors of modern humans unique to the South American continent.
Wow.
He even placed their origins way back in the Tertiary period, long before humans were generally accepted to have evolved elsewhere.
That is a really ambitious and bold claim.
Mm-hmm.
So what was Hrdlička's reaction to Ameghino's evolutionary scheme? Not positive, I'm guessing?
Profoundly skeptical is probably the right word. His central argument, as we've kind of been discussing, was that the empirical evidence he had examined just did not support such a long and independent evolutionary path for humans in South America.
Right.
Hrdlicka stuck to the prevailing understanding of human evolution at the time, which suggested a more recent origin in the Old World. He believed that the fundamental morphological characteristics of humans within each geological period had certain established boundaries, and he saw no credible evidence from South America that contradicted this broader picture. In his view, the skeletal remains and artifacts found in South America primarily represented variations within the species Homo sapiens, specifically the ancestors and descendants of the American Indian populations. He basically rejected the whole idea that South America was this cradle of unique and very ancient human evolutionary lines like Ameghino proposed.
Okay, so Hrdlicka is arguing these weren't primitive pre-Homo sapiens ancestors evolving in isolation. They were essentially modern humans who'd migrated to South America much later.
That's the core of his argument, yes.
Now, to support his critique, Hrdlicka also talked about various factors that could affect how bones look. and potentially lead to misleading interpretations about their age. This seems like a crucial part of his methodology.
Absolutely. Hrdlička recognized that interpreting the age and significance of skeletal remains needs a deep understanding of taphonomy, basically, the study of how organisms decay and become fossilized. He highlighted several factors that could easily lead researchers to overestimate how old bones were. One key factor was just the incomplete scientific knowledge at the time about all the various chemical and organic processes bones go through over long periods.
Right, we didn't know everything back then.
Exactly. Without a thorough understanding of these natural alterations, it was easy to misinterpret the condition of a bone as indicating great age when it might simply reflect specific environmental conditions or chemical interactions in the soil.
What were some of the other misleading factors Hrdlička pointed out?
Well, another significant issue he raised was the difficulty in distinguishing between natural perforations or markings on bones, maybe caused by soil processes or animal activity, and those that might have been intentionally made by humans, suggesting tool use or other cultural practices.
Ah, okay. Human action versus natural causes.
Right. Also, superficial chemical alterations, like staining from minerals in the soil, could give a false impression of fossilization and thus of greater age. And finally, Hrdlička pointed out that just the simple fact of bones becoming covered by mineral deposits over time could be mistaken for inherent fossilization, leading to wrong conclusions about their original age. He stressed that these kinds of superficial changes didn't necessarily mean the bone itself was truly ancient.
These are really important points. It shows that just how a bone looks isn't enough. You have to carefully analyze the context and rule out these other potential factors.
Definitely.
This really sets the stage for Hrdlička's detailed analysis of specific finds used to support claims of early man. The outline lists quite a few: Carcharana bones, Rio Negro skulls, rotiferius finds. Let's start with the Carcharana bones. What was the story there?
Okay, the Carcharana bones. They were brought to Buenos Aires by a fossil collector named F. Seguin. He claimed these bone fragments had been found in the Pampean deposits along the Rio Carcharana, and initially Florentino Ameghino himself actually lent some support to the idea that these bones were significantly old, based on their supposed geological context.
But Hrdlička, as we might expect by now, seems to have had his doubts. What were his specific reasons for skepticism about the Carcharana bones?
Well, Hrdlička's main concern was the fragmentary nature of the bones themselves. They weren't complete skeletons or even substantial portions, just isolated fragments.
Right. Hard to tell much from fragments.
Very difficult. It made it hard to definitively determine their original anatomical position or to compare them reliably to known human or hominin forms. Plus, he raised the possibility that these fragments might not have been in their original geological context anyway.
How so?
He suggested they could have been displaced from more recent surface layers and somehow got mixed into the older Pampean deposits through natural processes like erosion or animal burrowing. Interestingly, as time went on, even Ameghino himself reportedly expressed some later doubts about the original context and the true antiquity of the Carcharana bones. Hrdlička emphasized that without more complete specimens and a clear, undisturbed context, these finds provided very weak evidence for great human antiquity.
Fragmentary and potentially out of place.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly doesn't sound like a smoking gun for early humans. What about the Rio Negro skulls, found by the explorer Francisco P. Moreno?
Right. Moreno reported finding 2 human skulls in the Rio Negro region of Patagonia. One skull was said to have been found in a deeper geological layer, the other in a shallower context. And notably, both skulls were described as being deformed.
Deformed? How?
Well, the renowned anthropologist Hammy compared the so-called black skull, the deeper one, to the crania of Fuegian people. And another prominent figure, Alphonse Bertillon, also took measurements.
So were these deformities interpreted as signs of a primitive human type, maybe linking them to an early stage of evolution?
Well, while the deformities were certainly noted and discussed, the interpretation leaned more towards cultural practices rather than inherent primitiveness. Moreno himself suggested the deeper skull had a frontal deformation, while the shallower one showed a type of deformation characteristic of the Aymara people, a known practice of intentional artificial cranial deformation, shaping the skull in infancy.
Head shaping.
Exactly. Hrdlička, aligning with this view, didn't see these deformations as evidence of some archaic human form. He saw them as the result of either accidental pressure during development or deliberate cultural practices, which again pointed towards a connection with more recent indigenous groups rather than a truly ancient, distinct human ancestor.
That's a recurring theme, isn't it? Features that might initially look primitive or ancient often get explained later by cultural practices or just natural variations within more recent human populations.
It happens quite a bit in these early studies, yes.
Now, the Arroyo de Frias sound a bit more compelling on the surface. Reports of human bones mixed with charcoal, baked earth, burned stones, animal remains. What was Hrdlička's take on this seemingly significant association?
Well, Florentino Ameghino reported finding numerous fossil human bones at the Arroyo de Frias site, and they were associated with what seemed like evidence of human activity: charcoal, baked earth, suggesting hearths, burned stones, animal bones. It certainly suggested the possibility of ancient human occupation interacting with the local fauna.
That's promising.
But Hrdlička raised some very significant concerns about the documentation and verification of these finds.
What were his main criticisms? Issues with how they were discovered or recorded?
Yes, precisely. Hrdlička pointed out that, crucially, there were no independent corroborating scientific witnesses present at the time of the discovery. Ameghino's reports were largely based on his own investigations and those of people directly associated with him.
Okay, lack of independent eyes.
Right. This lack of external scientific verification made it difficult to be certain about the exact context of the finds and to rule out any potential biases in observation or interpretation. Furthermore, Hrdlička noted that the stone implements reportedly found at Arroyo de Frias looked strikingly similar to the types of tools known to have been used by relatively recent Indian tribes in the region.
So maybe not so ancient after all.
It raised the possibility that the human bones and the associated materials might not all be from the same ancient time period. They could have been mixed through later disturbances or even just represent more recent human activity. So while the initial report was intriguing, the lack of solid, independently verified context led Hrdlička to be very cautious about accepting Arroyo de Frias as definitive proof of great antiquity.
That need for independent verification and solid context keeps coming up. It seems absolutely crucial. Let's move to the Saladero skeleton, also discovered by Ameghino, reportedly near remains of Macurotus saber-toothed cat and Ursus bonarensis, an ancient bear, another potential case of humans and extinct megafauna together.
It does sound like it, and on the surface, that kind of association would certainly suggest they lived at the same time. Ameghino reported finding a nearly complete human skeleton near these extinct animal remains at Saladero.
Okay.
However, when the renowned paleontologist Hermann Burmeister examined the femur and teeth recovered from this skeleton, he expressed significant uncertainties about the precise burial depth of the human remains and how directly associated they were with the fossils of Macurotus and Ursus bonarensis.
So even though they were found nearby, the exact spatial relationship and the geological layers weren't clear enough to definitively prove they lived at the same time.
Exactly. The documentation just wasn't detailed enough to firmly establish that the human skeleton and the extinct animal fossils were part of the same undisturbed stratigraphic layer. There was no clear evidence ruling out the possibility that the human skeleton might have been buried later, maybe even intruding into a layer containing the older animal fossils. The precise context just remained ambiguous. Later, another researcher, Roth, even questioned if the local indigenous people even had the means to dig a proper grave, suggesting maybe it wasn't an intentional burial at all, though Hrdlička notes that specific objection isn't totally convincing. The bottom line is, the critical contextual info needed to definitively link the Saladero skeleton with the extinct megafauna was missing, making it hard to use this find as strong evidence for great human antiquity.
Ambiguity in context seems to be the Achilles heel for many of these early finds. What about the Venezuela's skull? Found by Roth, associated with a glyptodon carapace, the shell of another extinct giant mammal. Yet another potential human megafauna link.
The Venezuela skull is another one that generated a lot of discussion and different interpretations. Roth, who found it, considered the geological layers where it was found to be quaternary, which fits with the time of glyptodons. However, when other prominent scientists looked at the skull, like Rudolf Virchow and Hermann Burmeister, they offered somewhat different opinions on its precise age and its physical characteristics.
And what was Hrdlička's assessment? Did he see it as belonging to an ancient or primitive human?
Hrdlička provides detailed physical measurements of the Venezuela's skull in his work. Based on his own examination, the measurements, the overall morphology, he ultimately concluded that it didn't show any extraordinary features that would significantly distinguish it from the skulls of relatively modern American Indians.
So not primitive looking.
No. He argued there was no compelling evidence to suggest it represented a primitive human type indicative of great antiquity. So despite being found with the remains of an extinct glyptodon, the skull itself, in Hrdlička's view, looked like that of a relatively modern human, which raises questions about the contemporaneity of the association.
Right. So even with that intriguing association, the physical characteristics of the human remains themselves become key. Let's move to the Arrecifes skull. Our outline says Mochi tried to date it, and Hrdlička also examined it. What were their conclusions?
Right. Michele Mochi, an Italian anthropologist who also studied South American remains, tried to figure out the age of the Arrecifes skull based on how altered the bone was and the presence of calcareous incrustation mineral deposits on the bone.
Okay.
Based on these factors, Mochi suggested the skull likely belonged to one of the final phases of the Quaternary period, so indicating a more recent time frame, not a very ancient one.
Antarctica.
Hrdlička himself did a detailed examination, careful measurements, studying its morphology. His conclusions largely supported Mochi's assessment. He found no primitive features suggesting great antiquity and agreed it likely dated to a later part of the Quaternary.
Okay, so both Mochi's dating based on physical changes and Hrdlicka's morphological analysis pointed toward a relatively recent age for that one. Moving along, the Samburum bone skeleton. Initially mentioned by Burmeister, later called Homo caputiclinatus by Ameghino and Nietzsche. That's quite a specific name, inclined head man. What's the story?
Yeah, Hermann Burmeister briefly mentioned a fossil man skeleton found near Rio Samburumban. Later, Ameghino and Rudolf Nietzsche gave more detailed descriptions, coining the species name Homo caputiclinatus, man with inclined head.
Why inclined head?
They suggested this individual had a strongly forward-inclined head position, along with other skeletal features they interpreted as primitive, supporting their broader theories of early human evolution in South America.
And Hrdlicka's perspective on Homo caputiclinatus, did he buy the primitiveness argument?
Hrdlička viewed the information around this skeleton with some reservations. He noted that detailed descriptions and analyses only appeared quite late in the scientific discussion, giving less chance for thorough independent evaluation by others, including himself.
Timing again.
Yes. He also expressed skepticism about interpreting the inclined head position as a primitive trait. He suggested it could potentially be due to post-mortem deformation, or just the way the skeleton was recovered and reconstructed. Without more robust and earlier documentation, Hrdlicka considered the evidence for Homo caputiclinatus less than conclusive for demonstrating a truly ancient and primitive human form.
So the timing and detail of the reporting really mattered in his assessment. What about the Chicori bones? Skull and long bones found there, and Nietzsche apparently aligned them with a recent European type. That seems to directly contradict the idea of a unique South American early man.
That's precisely the point. At the Chicori site, a human skull and some long bones were found. When Nietzsche examined these remains, his description and analysis led him to conclude they closely resembled a relatively recent European human type. This finding directly challenged the notion that these bones represented a very ancient or morphologically distinct early South American population. It suggested instead a more recent origin, or maybe a connection to populations outside South America, which further undermined Ameghino's whole scheme of independent evolution.
That certainly adds another layer of complexity. Now, the Sotilio finds sound intriguing, a petrified human skull and bone fragments near Viscasia bones. Petrified often implies great age.
Signor de Carles discovered these remains in a deep ravine near Sotilio, and yes, the description of the skull and fragments as petrified naturally suggested significant antiquity. But Hrdlicka points to the identification of mollusk shells found in the same vicinity by Dr. William Healy Dahl, a renowned malacologist. Dahl identified these shells as belonging to species that are still living today, relatively recent in geological terms.
Recent shells next to petrified bones.
Exactly. This juxtaposition raised serious questions about the actual age of the deposit and consequently the human bones themselves. It suggested the petrification might just be a more recent process of mineral deposition rather than a true indicator of extreme age.
That's a stark contrast and certainly casts doubt on a very ancient origin for those human remains.
Yeah.
Now we come to the Ovidero's skeletal material, skull number 1 and skull A. A significant number of fossil human bones were reportedly found there. What were Hrdlicka's observations?
Hrdlička got to examine both skull number 1 and skull A from Ovidero at the Museo Nacional in Buenos Aires. He noted skull number 1 was an adult male. However, upon careful examination, he found no specific features indicating great geological antiquity. It just seemed consistent with the variations seen in more recent human populations.
In Skull A.
Skull A, also an adult male, showed a marked flattening of the occipital bone, the back of the head. Hrdlička attributed this flattening not to any primitive characteristic, but rather to the likely practice of artificial cranial deformation again, that cultural custom known among various indigenous groups. So again, neither of these skulls from Ameghino presented features that would support the idea of a very ancient human presence.
So even with a decent number of skeletal remains from Ameghino, Hrdlicka's detailed look revealed no compelling evidence of great geological age, often pointing towards more recent origins or cultural modifications.
That seems to be the pattern emerging, yes.
What about the Baradero find? A human skeleton attributed to the Middle Pampean geological formation. That sounds specific and potentially old.
A human skeleton was indeed found near Baradero and attributed by some researchers to the Middle Pampean Formation, which is a geological layer considered quite old. But Hrdlička notes that such isolated finds, where the attribution to an ancient stratum rests on somewhat unusual circumstances or specific interpretations of bone characteristics, often face general skepticism in the scientific community. He emphasizes that definitively proving the great antiquity of such finds is exceedingly difficult because of the inherent uncertainties in establishing the precise geological context and the possibility of later intrusions or misinterpretations. So, while the attribution to the Middle Pampean was made, it wasn't universally accepted as solid proof of a geologically ancient human.
That really underlines the high bar for proof needed to convincingly show geologically ancient humans, especially with isolated finds in potentially ambiguous contexts.
It's a very high bar, yes.
Now, the Arroyo Seisco skeleton, another find Ameghino assigned to his proposed primitive species, Homo caputiclinatus. This inclined headman keeps popping up.
Yes, the Arroyo Seisco skeleton was another key piece Ameghino used to support his concept of Homo caputiclinatus as an exceedingly primitive human form, even more so in his view than is Homo pampeus.
Okay, but Hrdlicka had criticisms.
He did. Hrdlička offered several critical remarks. He suggested the burial of the Arroyo Seisco skeleton might actually have been relatively recent. His reasoning was based on observing a small quantity of dark earth, possibly from a root system, noted on one side of the excavation.
That suggests.
It could indicate a more recent disturbance of the soil, potentially linked to a more recent burial that had intruded into older layers, giving a misleading impression of antiquity.
So what looked like a primitive skeleton in an ancient layer might actually have been a more recent burial made to look older or unusual by soil conditions. That's fascinating and cautionary.
It highlights the need for careful observation of the entire context.
What about Homo cemento, another proposed early human form described by Ameghino based on just a single mandible, a lower jaw?
Right. Ameghino described the Homo cemento mandible as having unique dental features and notably lacking a chin, a characteristic he likened to Neanderthal mandibles, suggesting a primitive status. However, Hrdlicka's careful examination of the specimen revealed a pretty significant error in the original description.
What was the error?
He determined that the mandible was actually that of a child, not an adult.
Oh.
The apparent lack of a chin, which Ameghino had highlighted as primitive, was simply characteristic of a juvenile mandible that hadn't yet fully developed its adult features.
Wow. A child's jaw misinterpreted as a primitive adult. That's a substantial error and a clear example of the pitfalls of relying on incomplete or misidentified remains.
A major interpretive mistake, yes.
Let's move on to the Miramar skull. This was the foundation for Ameghino's species Homo pampeus. He emphasized its supposedly primitive features as evidence of an early human presence.
Indeed. Ameghino considered Homo pampeus, based on the Miramar skull, to represent a very early and primitive human form in South America.
But others disagreed.
Yes. Rudolf Nietzsche did a detailed study of the Miramar skull and found nothing particularly extraordinary about its morphology. He even suggested that some features Ameghino saw as primitive might actually be the result of artificial cranial deformation, that head-shaping practice again.
Oh, okay.
Hrdlicka, upon his own examination, also observed signs consistent with artificial deformation and, based on his overall analysis, concluded against a great antiquity for this specimen. He found no compelling evidence that the Miramar skull represented a distinct, ancient, and primitive human ancestor.
So, once again, features initially seen as primitive could be explained by cultural practices or maybe post-mortem alterations, leading to a reassessment of its age and significance.
That's right. Alternative explanations were often available.
What about the two Nicosia skulls found by Bufiels?
Bufiels discovered two human skulls near the surface near Nicosia. Hrdlička got to examine one of these in detail. He noted its dolichocephalic, or long-headed form, its submedium size, and some signs of disease. However, despite these observations, he found no morphological characteristics that would suggest great antiquity. Plus, the fact they were found near the surface argued against them being significantly old geologically, as they'd have been subject to more recent environmental factors and potential disturbances.
Right, surface finds are generally less likely to be ancient. We're definitely seeing a consistent pattern in Hrdlička's investigations. Careful, critical examination often leading to more recent, less extraordinary explanations for finds previously used to argue for very early humans in South America.
It certainly seems that way, a pattern of skepticism grounded in detailed analysis.
Now, the story of Diprothomo platensis, the human skull fragment found during dry dock excavations in Buenos Aires. That sounds like it generated quite a bit of excitement initially, didn't it?
Oh, it did. It caused a significant stir at the time. When this fragment of a human skull was unearthed during construction in Buenos Aires, Florentino Ameghino immediately claimed it represented a very ancient human form, Diprothomo platensis, with primitive features indicating great antiquity. He even placed it very early in his proposed evolutionary scheme.
But his interpretation didn't stand.
No, it faced very strong and immediate critiques from several prominent researchers, Gustav Schwalbe, Otto Friedemann, Felix von Leschan.
What were their main points of disagreement? Why did they refute Ameghino's claims about Diprothomo so strongly?
Well, these researchers did their own detailed analyses of the fragment and came to a very different conclusion. They argued the fragment showed no significant morphological differences from the skulls of recent modern humans.
Okay.
Furthermore, they contended that Ameghino's initial orientation of the fragment was actually incorrect, and this incorrect orientation had led him to misinterpret its features and see primitive traits that just weren't there.
He held it wrong, essentially.
That was the argument, yes. Gustav Schwalbe, in particular, was quite forceful, famously stating that Ameghino's Diprothomo should be completely removed from any evolutionary lineage leading to modern humans due to the lack of supporting evidence. So what Ameghino initially hailed as key evidence was largely debunked by the broader scientific community.
That's a powerful example of scientific scrutiny and peer review, challenging and correcting initial interpretations, even from prominent researchers.
It's how the process is supposed to work, ideally.
Finally, let's discuss Tetraprothomo argentinus. This was based on a peculiar atlas vertebra, a neck bone, and a femur, a thigh bone, found at Monte Hermoso by Carlos Ameghino, Florentino's brother. Florentino Ameghino claimed these belonged to a very ancient human ancestor. This is going even further back into the Tertiary period, right?
Yes, Florentino Ameghino went incredibly far with this one, claiming the atlas and femur found by his brother at Monte Hermoso showed human-like characteristics and belonged to a human ancestor living during the Tertiary period. That's millions of years before hominins were generally thought to have emerged. An extraordinarily bold claim.
And met with skepticism, I assume.
Considerable skepticism right from the start. Otto Friedemann expressed strong doubts. Layman Nietzsche offered a different interpretation of the bone's morphology. Hrdlicka himself did a detailed analysis of both the atlas and the femur.
What did he find?
He compared the atlas to those of known Indian populations and the femur to various primates and other mammals. Ultimately, he concluded these bones did not definitively establish the existence of a human precursor in the Tertiary of South America. For instance, he pointed out that a human-like tubercle on the femur, which Ameghino had emphasized, actually had similarities to structures found in some anthropoid apes and even certain other mammals.
So, not uniquely human.
It suggested it could represent a case of atavistic regression, like the reappearance of an ancestral trait, rather than a unique characteristic of a human ancestor.
So even for this claim of a direct human ancestor from a vastly earlier time, Hrdlička found the evidence unconvincing, suggesting alternative explanations for the bone features.
Exactly. The evidence just wasn't strong enough for such an extraordinary claim.
Now, there's a brief mention in our outline about rodent gnawing. Why is that detail relevant here?
Yes. Hrdlička made the important observation that some markings found on certain bones, which had been interpreted by some as evidence of human manipulation or tool use, were in fact likely the result of gnawing by rodents or other non-human animals.
Okay.
This just highlights the critical need for careful, expert analysis of bone surface modifications. You have to distinguish between those caused by human activity and those resulting from natural processes or animal actions. Misinterpreting rodent gnaw marks as ancient human technology could obviously lead to completely wrong conclusions.
It really underscores the level of meticulous scrutiny needed, considering all possible explanations, even rodent teeth marks.
Every detail matters.
So after this incredibly detailed, systematic analysis of numerous finds and claims, what was Hrdlička's overall concluding summary regarding the evidence for geologically ancient man or human precursors in South America?
Well, his overall conclusion after reviewing all the lines of evidence presented up to that point was quite clear and pretty emphatic. The tangible traces of geologically ancient man or human precursors in South America, as presented by various researchers, were simply not convincingly established.
Not proven.
Not proven. He felt that the weight of the evidence, when subjected to rigorous scientific scrutiny, largely pointed to more recent human activity on the continent, primarily by the ancestors of the American Indian populations. He essentially debunked many of the key claims used to support the idea of a very early human presence or independent human evolution in South America.
Okay, so for you, our listener, the key takeaway from this deep dive into Hrdlička's investigations is that he played this crucial role in critically examining and, well, in many cases, debunking the early claims of a very ancient human presence in South America. His meticulous work strongly suggested that the evidence largely supported the relatively recent arrival and subsequent diversification of Native American populations, rather than a much earlier or independent evolutionary history on the continent.
And what's really significant, you see, is that Hrdlička's work kind of exemplifies the self-correcting nature of the scientific process.
Right.
His rigorous analysis of existing evidence, his emphasis on first-hand investigation and contextual integrity, his willingness to challenge prevailing theories based on careful observation. It all highlights how scientific understanding evolves through critical evaluation and the search for more robust evidence.
Yeah.
The debates and differing opinions among researchers that we've talked about today really underscore the dynamic and sometimes contentious nature of scientific inquiry.
It certainly makes you appreciate the complexities involved in trying to piece together the distant past from often fragmented and ambiguous evidence.
Definitely.
If you're interested in digging further into this fascinating topic, you might want to explore the original publications of researchers like Florentino Ameghino, Peter Wilhelm Lund, or Rudolf Lehmann-Nietzsche, to get a sense of their perspectives and how their ideas contrasted with Hrdlička's.
Yeah, see the arguments firsthand.
Exactly. You could also look into more recent archaeological and paleontological discoveries in South America to see how our understanding of early human migration and settlement has evolved in the century since Hrdlička's groundbreaking investigations.
Because science doesn't stand still. And this all raises a really important question for you to maybe mull over. If the evidence for extremely ancient humans in South America was considered weak and unconvincing in Hrdlička's time, what new discoveries, advancements in dating techniques, or alternative analyses in the century that has followed have either strengthened those early hypotheses or further challenged them? Have they maybe led to a completely revised understanding of when and how humans first populated this vast continent? It's a question that continues to drive research and spark debate in the field today.
A fantastic point to ponder indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into early man in South America, Hrdlička's investigations, here on the English Bookcast.
Thanks for listening.
We hope this exploration has given you some insightful perspectives on the history of paleoanthropological research in South America. Remember to subscribe to the English Bookcast and maybe share this deep dive with anyone who you think might find it as captivating as we do. Until next time.